What's going on, ladies and gentlemen? Christian and Horror here today with another video that is a lot of participation from the audience. What is the best decade of horror? Here's a question you see talked about in a lot of circles. And really, there's not really one definitive answer among a lot of these circles as well. But what I want to do here today is just like when we asked the question, what is the greatest horror movie ever made? Now, the comment section for that was riddled with amazing answers with a lot of great insight to why they chose these. So this should be just as fun. What is the greatest decade of horror? I have my answer, because that's all I can give is my opinion, right? Because what is really the greatest? I can tell you how I came to my answer. You know, when I look back at horror, I look back at the history of horror, there are so many amazing eras. You know, my wife, who actually is a big fan of the classic eras of the 30s and 40s and 50s, she loves that stuff. She tries to make me watch them all the time. And every now and again, I find myself really loving one of those movies, but the old era hasn't always been my favorite. But that's not to say that is one of the most amazing times for horror. So many great things, till this day, were established then. You know, you'll never get rid of Frankenstein, Dracula, the Wolfman. They'll be here forever. A lot of that came from novels, but still, it was the cinema that really made those images what they were. It's amazing when you think about it, the longevity of that. The longevity, it's still here. And I find myself really enjoying some of those old films now, the older I get. Especially some films from the 50s. We all know that the 60s really had a big swing and shift with the Psycho movie. You know, it wasn't exactly the first slasher film, but it really was the movie that kind of moved us out of the gothic world, as it were. And I think that Psycho in the 60s was a big movement change. And I think you could probably see that change show up a lot through the 60s as well. But it was really seemed like it was a period of old and new kind of combined, especially when you dive into the 60s. I was looking up all these titles, and some had this style of the old school with the gothic castles and the foreign places, and then some of these movies were really treading new design. Really interesting decade in the 60s. Then when I think about the 1970s, wow. I'll be very open and say that my favorite is the 1980s. My aesthetic, what I love, the music, the vibe, the clothing, the personalities. 1980s is my favorite, but this is what we think is the best, and I think I can try to be more objective about this. The 1970s. Here's a decade that, in my mind, it was almost if the studios weren't exactly sure what was working in the 70s. And that gave directors and screenplay writers to just write these stories and take these chances and these very individualistic ideas and go for it. The 70s, to me, have movies that have still not been taken off the throne as some of the greatest horror movies ever made. The Exorcist. Reagan is in stores every Halloween till this day. Texas Chainsaw freaking Massacre. What I thought was the greatest horror movie. You've got Halloween. We don't even need to go there. How many people love Halloween? It's one of the biggest horror movies ever. Alice, Sweet Alice. Many others. The Omen. These are movies that are legendary. Legendary. And I'm just scratching the surface. Jaws. Still one of the biggest movies till this day. It came out on 4K. People are buying the movie just so they can have it. They don't even have 4K players, but they want to buy Jaws because they know what Jaws means. So many films from the 70s. It was almost like because it was this time of, hey, let's just go and try this. This guy's got a good screenplay for this. I really enjoyed it. I don't know if there's anything out like this. Let's go do that. Let's try that. Let's just see if it works. That's the vibe I get from the 70s with these movies. So individualistic. Now, I love the 80s. I do. I love the 80s. It was a decade of a lot of sequels. It was a decade of a lot of great slasher films. It was a decade of a lot of excess. And I love it. I was just watching Sorority Babes from the Slimeball Bowl-orama, as you can see. Love the movie. But if I had to say what I thought the best was, it's tough because when you get into the 90s, there's some great stuff in the 90s. I love 90s horror. I do. Early, middle, and late 90s. 2000s as well. I think that the 2000s was a lot like the 80s. When you look back and you look at all these films, there are great films with that tongue-in-cheek vibe that there was in the late 80s specifically. Movies like Vacancy, or movies, just that were over excess gore. And there's a lot of that from the 2000s to 2009 era. And then the 2010s had some great stuff. But when I look back at what I think the best is, wow. I think that the 70s was just this absolute magical time of let's go for this idea because the screenplay's good, because the director believes in it. Let's try it. That's the vibe I get from the 70s. That's why I think the 70s is the best decade for horror movies. So I ask you guys, what do you think is the absolute best decade in horror? It's a tough question, I know, and we could all have different answers, and it's not like one of us is wrong or right. But I think it'd be interesting to see what everybody's ideas are. What do you think is the best? I think this is a really interesting question. And while I can openly admit that the 80s is my favorite, I think I can be a little bit more objective about the legacy of the 70s is just this monster of a decade for horror movies. Monster of a decade. So thank you guys for watching this video. Please let me know your story for this in the comments section below, and let me know, of course, what the best decade of horror is. Bye.